Hello, so I am very delighted to be here with Catherine Menon, whose collection Subjunctive Moods comes out in, a few weeks' time, in July.
Yes.
I was hoping you could tell us, you've won so many short story competitions, it's very, very impressive. How difficult was it to kind of decide which ones to put in the collection and which ones to leave out, or did you put them all in?
If only. It was difficult because obviously the stories hadn't been written with a single coherent theme, so they'd been written over a number of years for different competitions, some of which were themed in themselves. So it was really a process of looking at the stories that were there and identifying ones which did fit with a common theme, which did sort of hang together. And by that, I don't mean a theme as in, they're all set on a bus or something but sort of ones which seem to be saying the same thing in a certain sense, which seem to fit together, where one story might illuminate something that was in another story earlier on in the collection.
Yeah.
So there was quite a lot of back and forth with Farhana, with the editor, for the selection process, as well as the ordering process, to try and get that sort of sense of illuminating one story with another.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really enjoyed about the collection was just how multicultural it is, just in the sense of not only are there many different places that the stories are set in, and also even within England, there's like, you're all over the place, you're not just in one place. And there's a lot of influence, both kind of culturally and just in terms of place. And also it seemed to me that there was also this sense in which many of the characters are kind of seeking a feeling of belonging.
Yes.
I don't know if that was one of the things in your mind as you were...
It was this idea of essentially fractured identity, or identity where it isn't straightforward, and that could be cultural identity, or it could be geographical, or it could be even a more innate, who am I at this stage of my life, where have things taken me? So in terms of myself, my father's Malaysian Indian and my mother's family are from the north of England. So there's both of those areas are actually really rich in a sort of oral storytelling, a very verbal, almost a raconteurs, in a sense. They both have a tradition of someone sitting down and saying, right, let me tell you a story. So I was quite lucky to be able to draw on essentially elements of both of those cultures in putting the stories together, as well as you mentioned they take place in a lot of different places in Britain. My husband's Welsh, and obviously the Welsh have a fount of folklore, of mythology, and it was great to be able to sort of go to the places and draw on that.
But that's another thing that I think you do very well in the collection, which is that you have this kind of brilliant way of writing about the everyday, but at the same time within that you have these kind of mythical or, almost unreal kind of parts. So, for example, one of your characters believes that when she was a child she managed to turn into a mermaid. And,
yes.
And then you have these kind of vampire-like creatures. I'm not going to be able to say their name
correctly.
correctly.
The Pontianacs. Yes, which they're... it's a Malay folklore. They're essentially blood-sucking, very beautiful young women who prey on men. But they've essentially... You see them a lot in Malaysian horror films as well. So while they're a traditional folklore element, I really like the idea that they've been kept up to date almost.
Yeah.
I suppose it's similar in a way to vampires in Western culture. You do have this sort of extremely old traditions of vampires, and then you've got things like Twilight, so people modernise myths. And I really like looking at how you might, in a very personal sense, modernise a myth, how you might say, well, this isn't part of my real everyday life, but what if it were? How could it sneak in sideways? So you get things like the woman who thought or imagined she turned into a mermaid, or the woman who adds an extra hour when she has daylight saving that isn't part of her normal life. Things sort of that come in sideways, I think.
And that actually end up being a huge part of your sense of self.
Yes, well,
I mean, even the story at the end with the seagulls.
Yes, yes, which I must admit is one of my favourites. That was one of the first stories I actually wrote.
Oh.
So, but I think they do. I mean, if you think of when you were a child, your imaginary world was just as real as your, as the sort of day-to-day world. And I think probably for a lot of people, it sort of still is.
Yes.
We all imagine winning the lottery or something like that. And it does feel just as real as, getting on the number 43 bus.
Yeah, and actually your lady, Foxgloves, Tracy.
Oh, yes.
This young mum who's had one child already taken away from her, but has kind of lives in this fantasy that, almost like a fairy tale.
Yes.
And it's such a sad and also beautiful story. And I think that I wonder if you would agree that, in a sense, the way we live is about telling stories anyway.
I think it is.
And how we understand ourselves is to tell us a narrative of ourselves. And I feel like your stories kind of have that feeling in them.
It is. It absolutely is. So even when when you go to a party and someone says, "What do you do?" or which is an awful question, by the way. Then, you construct a narrative around your life. This is who I am, which may or may not fit. And I think we do it subconsciously. And I really like the idea of someone like the woman in Foxgloves doing it consciously, saying in her life she is quite unlikely to get the happy ending that she wants. But she has access to this wealth of mythology and folklore and tales and updated tales and the never-ending story and everything that you can put your finger on. She can say, there's a happy ending in that. So how can I sort of slip my life into that in a way?
Yeah.
So it's quite escapist, really, I think.
And I wonder whether the way that you're talking about the stories and kind of the ideas behind the stories, whether that has also affected the way that you've written them. Because I think one of the things that I notice in your writing is that you are so, it's very rich in metaphor and simile, but really interesting ones that kind of add layers that you wouldn't expect. So, for example, I took a couple of lines from the first story. The hotel dining room turns out to be the old kitchen, skinned over with eggshell paint and chandeliers. We all look lumpish and cream-fed in that glare, squeezed into mothball suits and satin dresses tight as someone else's skin. And there's so much going on in there.
Yes, I really did. I have to picture them when I write very, very vividly. But one of the things that I do tend to want to get across is not just the actual visual look of the kitchen, but what the main character is thinking. So, yes, she does, in that case, see, all of these people dressed up in suits that are probably too tight to them, for them. But at the same time, she's seeing her old kitchen. She's seeing what's under the skin of it. And I must admit, I have a weakness for trying to get that in, to sort of have these two layers of story, where on the one hand you have the real everyday elements, and on the other you have the character's thoughts and imagination, essentially enriching that.
But I think there's even more going on there. I mean, the cream-fed, just that sense of the kind of person that's turned up to that dining room. And,
this character is quite...
The luxury that they bring with them.
Yes.
And just that gives you a sense of the sort of doughy... I mean, it brings a lot of things with it. And I think the collection and your writing is full of those layers, which is, really quite something.
Oh, thank you.
But you're doing it consciously, obviously.
Yes.
So I wonder, talking about all of these things, what it is that you kind of hope, as you're creating this collection, what you hope your reader goes away thinking about?
Partly what happens next, but I think more I'd like them to think about almost what happened before. Why is that person the way they are? Because in very few of the stories, I think, there's an actual sort of cataclysmic plot event. They're generally not action-packed, sort of thrillers with... I don't think there are any car chases, for example. I know.
I didn't miss them.
So what I really want to do is sort of to get the reader thinking, what brought this person to this place of generally sort of fairly significant emotional turmoil, but not necessarily linked to any actual event. So, not necessarily, oh yes, they're in emotional turmoil because they were in a car chase, but what has happened in their life and what parallels are there in real life to the people that, you know, I might see on the bus. So essentially I want the reader to, or I'm hoping that the reader might recognise elements from their own life or you know, sort of the life of one of their family members or something in this, and essentially take it further. You know?
Yeah, actually I can think of a couple. So for example, Subjunctive Moods and the one set in Australia.
The names of things.
Yes. Both of them, in a way, there's this moment that something happens that character carries with them through their life. It sits oddly with them. It's something which affects them very deeply, but which, you know, and actually I can think of others as well. And then, you know, it's years later somehow that they're still trying to unpack the relevance of that moment for them.
I think it is like that. I genuinely think, obviously this is only from my own experiences, that the significant moments in your life tend not to be the ones that you would expect. You know, the sort of cliche, the wedding day, your 30th birthday celebration. And obviously those are significant, but I think the things that form you are often very, very small and very difficult to explain to someone.
Yeah.
So in the names of things, it's very difficult to explain why that moment in the shed with Robert telling the story, you know, surrounded by these chickens at night, it would be significant if you went to someone and said, this was actually a moment where my life sort of hinged. I think they would say, well, to be honest, that sounds daft. Yeah. But I think we all do have those. I think we all do have these sort of moments where our lives change, and it's very difficult to say why. Again, it goes back to constructing the narrative. So when we construct a narrative, we're shaped by very obvious, very apparent events in our life. But I actually think that is a construct, that in fact the things that shaped our lives were the random things that happened on a sunny Friday at 3 p.m. that nobody else noticed, and that actually shaped us much more than the big 30th birthday party we had on Saturday at 8 p.m.
And do you think that the short story is works particularly well for that kind of outlook, that sort of it captures those moments well? Do you think that's the case?
I think it does. I like short stories where there is that hinge, and I think a short story can pivot around that in a way that a novel possibly couldn't, because it's much longer, it's much more of an actual task to read and to comprehend and to connect with. And I think if you have one pivot point in a novel, it runs the risk of being a twist ending or something like that.
So given that I know you are now writing a novel,
yes.
Has it felt very different to move from the short story form?
It has actually, which I wasn't necessarily expecting it to feel quite so different. A novel is much bigger, a novel is much baggier. I think Ali Smith once described it as writing a novel is somewhat like having a chronic illness, which sounds terribly morbid, but a novel you have to focus a lot more on the ongoing connections, whereas with a short story, while there are some people who can spread a short story over many, many years, Alice Munro is someone who absolutely can. I think a lot of short stories work best because they are about one tiny self-contained little moment. And a novel can't really do that, simply because there's a limit to what you can say about it. A lot of the impact of that moment is felt just in the few seconds afterwards. And you can't really write a novel that focuses only on a few, or at least I can't, that focuses only on a few seconds. I don't want to say nobody can. But
well, James Joyce tried to do The Day.
Oh, yes. So. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm in Joyce's league. But
well, don't say that now.
It would be nice.
So I wondered what other writers you're inspired by.
Margaret Atwood would have to be one of my number one favourite writers. I think because she has a certain trick of dissociating the writing voice from the voice of her protagonist. So at times you do feel that Margaret Atwood herself, or the narrator, for whom Margaret Atwood is standing in, is addressing you directly, which you've sort of got these three layers. You've got Margaret Atwood writing, you've got this narrator with an obvious voice, and then you have the protagonist. And I love those layers. Margaret Drabble is another person who does it very well. Obviously, it's a thing to do with being called Margaret. It's as well as those. I must admit, I am a fan of Salman Rushdie. I don't think it's possible not to be. In fact, I've been reading some of his short stories, which again are absolutely perfectly formed. They're shorter than we would necessarily expect a short story to be now, I think, but they take exactly as much room as they need to. Other than Salman Rushdie and Margaret Atwood, obviously Alice Munro is one of my favourite short story writers. I think there's a certain mastery to the way she writes, a certain sort of a quiet magnificence, if that makes sense. She doesn't shout about things, but her sentences stay with you afterwards. Another writer who does that, who's written, I think, one novel and a couple of other short stories that I've read and absolutely loved, is Preeta Samarasan, who's a Malaysian writer with an absolute mastery of slipping in little aspects of magic realism into the very mundane day-to-day.
Something that you're doing.
Which is, yes. Yeah. I do owe her a debt.
And the other thing I wanted to ask was a bit more about what you are working on now.
Oh, well, as you said, yes, at the moment it's a novel. So it's set in Malaysia in the 1980s, and it's to do with a girl discovering her family history there. Part of the genesis of this was my father's family were there in Malaya during the Japanese occupation, and I was listening to stories that he was telling and stories his family were telling, and also reading fairly similar accounts in newspapers and interviews that I found in the British Library. And one of the things I noticed in all of these stories is that there are holes in them, and there are holes in exactly the same place in many of the stories. So obviously the invasion and occupation was quite traumatic, and there were atrocities that were perpetrated. But in many of the stories that you read now, these atrocities happened to someone else. It wasn't my sister, it wasn't my brother, it wasn't my father. It was the family down the road, it was the family in another village, it was my next door neighbour. It wasn't me. So to read these, you always have these missing, these gaps where these atrocities are, where people have essentially put them at arm's length and described it as happening to someone else, quite deliberately, quite consciously, because it isn't something that a lot of people want to co-opt into their family history. And I wanted to explore these holes, to explore this sort of almost deliberate idea of setting out to tell a story with lacunae in it, with these omissions. So what I came up with was the idea of a girl trying to fill in these omissions, essentially to discover what happened to her mother during the occupation, but to have to piece it together from the stories that her grandmother tells her. And I think with a lot of people, by the time you get to be a grandmother, by the time you get to be about 80, you're done with pretending, you're done with being nice, and you feel, I can tell the stories that I want to finally. So there's this also added layer on it, as well, of the grandmother essentially being unashamedly herself. And if she feels like lying, then she will, which of course complicates matters a lot.
Yes.
So I'm currently on the second draft of that. So
brilliant.
Yes, so hopefully that should be finished. As I mentioned to you, I'm doing an MA at City. So one of the requirements for that, I would actually really recommend it. One of the requirements is that you complete a novel. So it's got a built-in deadline, which is handy.
Very handy.
Yes.
Oh, well, I really appreciate you coming and talking to me. And please, everyone, do go out and buy Subjunctive Moods, which comes out on the 5th of July.
On the 5th of July, yes.
It's really great great collection and a good way to start getting addicted to Catherine's work. So thank you so much for coming to talk to me, and I look forward to talking to you in the future when you finish the book.
Oh, thank you. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thanks.